Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will be able to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we'll be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question, please do not wait. Don't hesitate. Just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And we hopefully will be able to get to as many questions as we can near the end of today's webinar. And I think with that, unless Jade, you let me know in chat whether we're going to be doing a drawing, but with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is the state of open source security. This is a panel discussion that is based on our ebook that we just released, I think it is, but it's on that same topic. And I have a very smart person who is joining me on today's webinar, who is going to be talking about the state of open source security with me, and that's Jeffrey Martin, who is the Senior Director of Product over at WhiteSource. Hey, Jeffrey, how are you?
Hi, everybody. Nice to be here. I love this topic, so it's fun to talk about.
Ah, that's good, because we will have plenty to talk about.
And just to reiterate, please ask questions. I love questions.
Yes. And also, we are going to be doing a drawing at the end of today's webinar for 3 $50 Amazon gift cards. So please, folks, stick around, and hopefully you'll be one of our 3 lucky winners. So, okay, with that, as I said, the title of today's webinar is the state of open source security, and it's based on an ebook that I am going to. I always forget to actually advance my slides. So this is Jeff, this is me. And this is the ebook that we have available to pretty much everybody, but attendees who registered for today's event will be getting a link to access this ebook via email as well. So let's see. So yeah, so let's go ahead and kick off this right now. So as I said, today's discussion is going to be based on a lot of the principles that are in that ebook. But really it's all about open source security, what it entails, why it's important, why it can be so darn difficult for companies sometimes. But I think it's probably important that we set the stage a little bit and talk about, start by talking about open source code. And that's really the impetus for this discussion. I mean, obviously, Jeff, please feel free to interrupt me at any time, but there's some major benefits to using open source code, including the ability to just kind of save time in your building. But there's also a lot of security challenges that come with open source code.
Yeah, and believe me, I never have a hesitation on interrupting, unfortunately. Just how I am. But I mean, look, fundamentally, open source is almost a symptom of another bigger trend, which is increasingly we compose applications instead of coding them from scratch, which means reusing components that other people have made. We're all building with Lego bricks and building out our applications with relatively little proprietary code we're adding. Some of that's commercial, you might buy a tool set, but for the most part, something around 80% is what we see of the code in an application is these reusable open source components.
Right.
Some of them are huge chunks of code, so it just adds up. But realistically, it's really a symptom of how modern application development works. You don't build everything from scratch, you reuse what you can. And if it's free and open, there's very little reason not to choose that versus paying somebody. So
yeah,
ultimately, every application has open source now. There's no real exceptions except for very strange, pacemakers. That's about it.
Okay. Well, I read somewhere that it's like 96% of commercial code actually has open source elements to it. I mean, that's an amazing amount of open source code that's out there. Yeah.
And I mean, and you think about all the things, software is of course everywhere, as we all know, but there's those non-obvious applications like, self-driving cars or, open source is in there, tons of it.
Mm-hmm.
in everything. I joked about pacemakers. I'd be a little shocked if pacemaker software didn't have a bunch of open source code in it, actually.
Well, there's got to
So
be some sort of element, yeah. So,
yeah,
but I mean, but obviously there's the security challenge with that because the open source code is basically, available to anybody. So, anybody can see that code and they can kind of uh, look through it and find those vulnerabilities that I mean, we'd be silly to say that they didn't. There were no vulnerabilities in
yeah,
any sort of code. So, it's kind of
it's
scary.
it's kind of funny. It's one of the benefits and one of the biggest challenges, just to use our
Right,
title there.
right,
Sometimes I
right,
get, I
right.
get
Yeah.
clever and loop back, but so fundamentally, the benefit of open source is that it's open.
Right.
When a vulnerability is found, it's disclosed and you know about it and you can fix it. But there is a gap in time between when you know about it and when it is fixed. And when you know about it as a developer or a user of open source, or just a member of the open source community, that's the exact same time all the bad actors know about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, and it's disclosed publicly and is relatively easy to exploit at that point. So that is where bad actors focus, that gap between the vulnerabilities disclosed and it's fixed when, by you. Nobody discloses a vulnerability without saying how to remediate it and fix it. But that doesn't mean you're instantly updated and everything is up to date. That gap is where your big window of attack is available.
So there's also not only that, there's also that issue of responsibility. I mean, you mentioned that nobody discloses a vulnerability without also having a fix, but who actually owns open source code to fix? And say obviously the Apache struts is probably one of the biggest the biggest issues that we've heard about over the last couple of years, where that there was a major flaw in Apache structs, and a lot of companies they didn't get the patch, or they didn't actually apply the patch,
Yeah,
and that
it's
made
it's
their
more of that
systems extremely
gap,
vulnerable. Yeah,
right?
yes,
Everybody knew this thing existed, but nobody updated it to actually
right,
fix it. And
yeah,
and that's really what I was hitting on, is that gap between when the problem is known, and usually
hmm
you know the fix too, and actually applying it. Um, and it just fundamentally, that is a huge challenge. There are other ones with open source. One of the ones that I'm currently paying a lot of attention to is the other definition of open, not just that you're transparent, but it means anybody can contribute.
hmm
And unfortunately, we're seeing increasing amounts of attacks where you know, bad actors contribute code that gets approved, this released, and then you have to do a rollback of a version or something like that. There's been a few recent examples. I wish I could remember the names, but they all do kind of blend together, where it looked like a few state actors had actually done some injection through the open source community, approved everything else, but that opened up holes that way. So again, it's sort of the double-edged sword. Open in
right.
terms of transparency means that the bad guys know what's wrong, but also open in terms of contribution means that you have to be careful about who you let in and who you take contributions from.
And that can be a difficult thing because that whole vetting process. I mean, who's to say whether somebody should or is able to take part in that process? I would think that at least at the beginning, or at least sometime, that you'd welcome as many folks as who wanted
Sure.
to be involved. So where do you cut it off and say, oh, everybody but you? So
Right.
yeah.
And I think, the big challenge there is a lot of the open source communities starting to do things like actually inspecting every line of code before they allow it to be committed, just to make sure, right? That way you're
hmm
not trusting anybody, you know what's happening.
That's a manpower issue there,
It
though. I
it
mean,
is.
if you are going through every single line of code, you've got a lot of time on your hands, I think, and I don't know of
Yeah.
anybody who does.
No.
So anyway, anyway. All right. So we've gone over some of the challenges, and Jeffrey, you said that there are many more, but what we hope to do with this ebook actually is kind of lay the groundwork if you will, for some security best practices that organizations can keep in mind when they're using open source code, just to help them, keep their applications secure, keep their code secure, just kind of think maybe a little bit more about how to go about doing that, and just keep it top of mind. So, I want to go ahead and start. Like I said, we have 5 of them, and I want to make sure that we get to all of them. And but as we said at the top of the hour, if you guys have a question, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll hopefully have about 10 minutes or so near the end of the webinar to actually go through the audience questions. So that's what I'm shooting for. So let's start with this first best practice, which is to establish policies. And it's kind of a given. You've got your rules and your regulations, but because open source is normally kind of an ad hoc, kind of an add-on type, if you will. It's not like part of a larger bundle. It's there to kind of help speed delivery for application development. But if you don't do it correctly, you're introducing a lot of sloppiness, if you will. I don't know.
Yeah, it boils down to control,
Mm-hmm.
which is almost like a 4-letter word in some circles, but it really does focus on control, because how do you mitigate the challenges of open source?
Right.
The answer is you have to control certain things. You have to control what you put in. You have to control, what your criteria is for allowing it in, and you have to control how you fix things. And all of that requires visibility and traceability of who's doing what to which items. And sort of in general, that's sort of lumped into policies and workflows.
Oops.
Now, they do focus in a few different areas, at least for open source. So the 3 big policy areas are really legal,
Mm-hmm.
licensing, still an important piece. You have to make sure you know that you're allowing things that are licensed correctly into your software, so that you're not causing yourself legal problems. Vulnerabilities, which is a never-ending process, right? Licenses don't
Right.
change very often, but vulnerabilities pop up every day. And there's a third one, which is just a lot of more housekeeping type policies, right? Hey, wait a minute, we've had this in our code and we're not using it at all, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So there is that third category. But let's focus on the first 2, licensing and security. So the licensing is easiest to understand the policies on, I think, because what it really boils down to is knowing what you have, how it's licensed, and knowing what licenses you're okay with versus the ones you're not. And that's where the policies really start hitting. 1, nobody should be adding any code if you don't know how it's licensed.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty fundamental policy.
Right. Right.
But then second, once you know what it's licensed, you need to have some list of the licenses you're okay with. Easiest way to do that is a whitelist, right? Here are the licenses that are okay to use in our software.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a license that's not on that list, has to be evaluated. Are we okay with these actual terms? That is a lot easier than doing a blacklist, which is here are the ones we don't want.
Mm-hmm.
It's weirdly easier to do a whitelist and approve things than to just say we don't want these. And the reason is new licenses do pop up, or there's one that you haven't included in your lists. You want your default to be no. Like, unless I say it's okay, this license is not okay. Not just every license works except for these.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a whitelist policy works better for licensing. I don't know if you have any thoughts here, Charlene. I'm
Well,
just
yeah, I wonder is when we're talking about policies and whitelisting, is there, would a best practice also be to kind of have that open source code repository, if you will, in your company that the developers, should go to first before they go out and look for other open source code to use, or how does that work within the organization?
Sure. So there's 2 big models out there, and they both can work for different environments and different types of development and different types of companies. There's one model where, sure, you have whitelists for licenses, but essentially you create one repository.
Hmm.
And that repository contains all of the different components that are okay to use. Essentially, you start whitelisting libraries and packages. And you say, great, this has passed our checks. Developers, if you need an open source component, pull from this repository. You will get the right version, the right licensing. You don't have to worry about it. It's all approved.
But there's
That
a management
is,
a management of that's associated with that, though. I mean,
correct.
because if we're talking about, making sure that the code is up to date and it's any vulnerabilities have been addressed, is that somebody's responsibility then, the owner of that
Yes.
repository?
And it turns into a big overhead spend.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make sense for most of the small or medium-sized businesses, but if you're a big bank, it makes a
Mm-hmm.
lot of sense, right?
Yeah,
You
sure.
don't have to worry too much about the pieces. You can say, these are the ones that are here. You know, we've got a little team working on that. It's great. Doesn't help you much if
Hmm.
you're a 10 developer shop, though, right? It's not
Right.
practical to do at that size. And that's where the other model really comes in. And it's always funny to me to talk about best practices because there's usually more than one for any given problem based on how you're situated.
That's why it's
Um,
plural, practices, not
yeah.
practices.
um, and look, and the other way is you essentially you approve them and bring them in, and you have whitelist policies for things like licenses you allow, but you're not whitelisting the components themselves. You're running a check
Hmm.
as they're being consumed, as they're being introduced. And you can do that in a lot of different ways, right? But it all starts with actually educating your developers what your policies are, um, so they're not, trying to put things in all the time that aren't going to comply,
Right.
um, and making sure they're empowered so that they have the ability to choose something different. Um, and that's really what it boils down to, is a lot of education. You
Hmm.
need the policies, but you need to educate the actual end users on those policies so that it's still an efficient way of going. So that when they're selecting an open source component, they're not bringing in something with a GPL license that is going to get rejected anyways. They've just wasted a bunch of time, right? Um, Realistically, that's the way most small and medium businesses try to implement this if they're serious about it. But it is still more controlled than what I think is still, generally speaking, the status quo in that area,
Hmm.
which is, you know, it's fine. The developers know what they're doing, and if there's a problem, we'll deal with it afterwards. Which is not the right way to do this. You don't want people checking all the stuff into their code and then running a check to make sure it's licensed, once a quarter. By that point, you've done 6 releases and it's too late.
Right,
So,
right. Yeah.
you still want to be very proactive about it.
Yeah,
Um,
well, it's not a situation where you want to ask for forgiveness afterwards. So
right.
it's because that could be that could
Too
be very
much risk.
detrimental. Exactly,
And
exactly.
I guess the other big set of policies is security. And this
Hmm.
is the one that it just never ends. Um, if it's a piece of software you're using, people will find new vulnerabilities. That's just how
Right.
that works.
Hmm.
And you have to remediate those. You have to fix them. And the right way to fix them can be very complex depending on what it is. So you need policies so that you're, one, focusing on just the fixes you need to do, right? So maybe you care about the severity and that's where you want to draw your line, right?
Hmm.
Anything that's a critical severity or above, we need to fix within a month or one sprint. But the low ones, we can handle those when we get to them.
Right.
You need to have policies like that, because if you're trying to keep up with everything at maximum speed, you better have somebody who's doing it full time and just focusing on just that, because there's just too much of it. So you have to have these policies in place to be able to triage it, essentially. There's other things you can leverage in these policies other than severity, if you will, or
Hmm.
criticality.
Hmm.
A lot of times you establish it based on where it's being used in your product. Is it infrastructure, something like struts, or is
Right.
it a web component that isn't really likely to expose anything serious. It's not e-commerce or anything.
Hmm.
So putting in the business impact there inside your triage policies is also a good idea.
All right. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next one
Sure.
real quick, which we actually have already kind of started to discuss, which is build and maintain an open source inventory. But this is more than just a repository, though. I mean, this
It
could
is.
also, well, I'm going to let you talk about it, Jeff. I'm going to let you kind of talk about what it means to build and maintain an open source inventory from a developer and a business standpoint.
So it's funny to me. If you had told the developer 20 years ago, one of the big things you're going to need to really focus on is inventory. I think they
They'd
would
be
have
like,
looked at you like a
yeah,
crazy person and said, "We're not a manufacturing firm."
right.
And the fact of the matter is, nowadays we kind of are.
Hmm.
Like I said, we have all these components we're putting together, right? It's not actually fundamentally dissimilar from, how iPhones are constructed.
Right.
Tons of parts, tons of suppliers. In our case, in our industry, it's mostly open suppliers. But you need to have, if you will, and forgive the wonky phrase from my operations days, uh, supply chain management.
Hmm.
And that starts with knowing what you're using and where it comes from. That inventory is key for a lot of reasons, but to focus on the open source reasons, um, you can't fix things if you don't know what they are.
Exactly.
And generally speaking, nowadays, we have to disclose a lot of our inventory. Third-party component lists on websites, things like that.
Hmm.
At minimum, if you're in business and software, you're either eventually going to go public or you're going to get purchased. That's pretty much the two end goals. Um, both of those require an open source inventory. It's actually my company, White Source. It's how we were founded. Our CEO sold the company, had a
Hmm.
problem figuring out all the open source he had, and said, other people must have this problem. Let's start there.
Hmm.
We'll make a
Interesting.
software. Like, if I have this problem, other people do. Let's sell the software.
Yeah.
So, we expanded that into licensing and security, of course, but it all does start with knowing what you have. It's easier said than done
Yeah.
because what you have can be very complex. Transitive dependencies, especially, are extremely hard to trace through. So, just because I'm using, Struts has other stuff in it.
Hmm.
And that might have a vulnerability, but maybe the parent doesn't have that fix available in its package yet.
Hmm.
So knowing what you have is always the first step, but the way it's structured and where it's from matters just as much as its name, or how it's licensed.
Yeah.
It's a little bit bigger than just pure, here's my repository and all the items. You do want to have some of that traceability in there if you can.
And you also want to recognize how it impacts other parts of the code or other such as APIs or just kind of a general otherwise you're going to have this domino effect, if you will. If you have a vulnerability in one piece of your code that happens to impact, say, an API that runs another piece of code to connect them, and it can really become this cascading effect if you introduce a vulnerability that is that isn't fixed and has that ability to just kind of go through the entire supply chain
Right.
in your case, to use your
Exactly.
vernacular.
Yeah, I mean, stick to manufacturing. Sometimes you got to do a recall. So,
Right.
um,
Right. Exactly.
but there is another important point here with inventories, which is
Hmm.
that it is almost always plural in modern applications. You have an inventory of your code, but you do have things like containers you're using. They have an
Right.
inventory.
Hmm.
Maybe your infrastructure of some, you're doing some deployment. Your database. There's inventories, never just
Right.
one.
All right. I'll
And
change this slide then.
well, I just, yeah, you want an inventory of
Yeah.
everything, but there
Right.
is some pieces, right? Especially in containers nowadays, you do want to know what's in that container.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, that's a whole other webinar. We'll do that
Yeah, it is.
another time.
Yeah.
All right, great. So moving rapidly along then, our third best practice is, identify those open source risks. And this is more than just vulnerabilities. As I said before, we're talking about like, licenses, we're talking about supply chain, we're talking about the impact of one vulnerability on the code at large. And it's not just security violation or security vulnerabilities. It's the risk of using licenses that or not using licenses when you're supposed to, which could open you up to actually getting sued or some other sort of litigation. But
Sure.
yeah, what am I missing here, Jeffrey, when we're talking about these open source risks that are beyond just security?
Sure. So, okay, the security one, I think we all understand, right?
Yeah.
We can put that one aside for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Licensing is actually pretty easy to understand as well, right? If
Right.
you use the wrong license and somebody can sue you, or suddenly, your all of your code is supposed to be open source. So licensing is a relatively understood risk. There are other risks. Most of them revolve around the same risks you have with any piece of software. There are quality concerns almost all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That is a huge risk, and I'm just talking individual component quality. One of the things we actually own in at White Source, we bought a product called Renovate Bot. It's open source itself, and what it does is just sits on your server and actually keeps a little inventory and it tells you if new versions come out.
Mm.
Um, but because of that, we actually get to see some data. Things like people updated to something and then suddenly roll it back, a day later. And most of the time that's due to quality issues, right? It's like any other piece of software. I'll use Windows as an example.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, it's Windows 10, continuous delivery, et cetera. But
Right.
back in the day, you couldn't have paid me to upgrade XP to ME within the first year because I knew it was going to be completely cruddy until they fixed all the bugs, right?
Yeah. Well, that's kind of where we
Um,
are with Mac. So,
yeah, it's the same thing. You're still stuck in the dark ages there. But
Right. Yeah.
but
All
you know,
right. All right. All right.
sorry, a little Mac bashing.
I
Great,
know. I know.
great hardware though. So anyways, the totally threw myself off. Um, so fundamentally, it works the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
Open source does have its quality issues sometimes. Updating right away, for instance, isn't always a great idea. And that has to be balanced against the security risk because maybe that
Mm-hmm.
has a fix in it that you need. So there's a lot of balance in there. Any kind of risk management requires knowledge. So everything else we've talked about, having an inventory, you can't manage a risk if you don't know what's there.
Mm-hmm.
But it also requires as much knowledge as you can gather from sources you might not think. Um, you know, Before you select an open source component, is it maintained regularly?
Right.
Very simple problem, but every once in a while I'll see somebody actually put in a library that hasn't been changed in 2 years, and you're like, that's not a great plan. Like, find something else that works and does the same thing that is being more actively maintained.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's just a great idea to make sure that any open source you use has a active community looking for vulnerabilities, fixing quality problems. Um, that's just a whole layer of risk you don't want to deal with. And you can kind of mitigate just by making sure you're in an open community, active community rather. And then there's that other risk too, which is your good old-fashioned business risk, but that's a
Mm-hmm.
whole giant topic. Buy versus build versus open source, etc.
Right, right. Yeah, well, that's a question. I don't even know if that's a risk. I think that's more of a business decision, right? How much money do you want to throw at creating this code? And is it that much safer in the end if you're using
Right,
proprietary versus open source? Yeah,
so I mean, right, safety, reliability, kind of your usual risk categories here, right?
exactly,
Um,
exactly. So. All right. Well, we are, let's see, doing a quick time check here. We're about 30 minutes past the hour already. We have two more best practices. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next one, unless you have any final thoughts on this one, Jeff.
I'll move on. You know me, you got to
Okay.
keep me moving.
All right. Keep you moving. All right. Next one, map known security vulnerabilities to open source components in use. This seems like a gimme. And yet I get the idea, I get the feeling that a lot of organizations are not doing this.
I mean, I think it's here mainly because people aren't.
Yeah.
Like, hey, by the way, um, it should be a gimme, right?
Uh-huh.
Like, you just have to. There's a lot of sources for this data, right?
Hmm.
I'll throw my little pitch out. We're one of them, right? White source. This is what we do.
Hmm.
Get your inventory and tell you, what vulnerabilities are in that inventory, but amongst 100 other things. But fundamentally, this is where a lot of people stop. They bring in an open source component and it's kind of just there, and maybe they're a little more advanced and they have an inventory and they can keep track of everything they have, but they're not, watching that repo for that open source component and grabbing the latest versions. They're
Hmm.
not active members of every community that they consume. Realistically, that's at that point it would actually be less work to just build a proprietary, right?
Right,
So
right.
they're not in these communities. Maybe they're in one or two out of the 500 open source components they're using.
Hmm.
You don't know what you don't know, and unfortunately, in the security world, you have to know.
Right.
That sentence was horrible and needed a map, but
And yet I understood it. So, so what can organizations do then? I mean, if they're using, say, open source code in 96% of their applications, that's a whole lot of open source code to manage and to keep track of, to understand where the vulnerabilities are, especially since maybe it's code that they've been using for the last 4 or 5 versions of their software or something, and
or
there's
worse, years. I see
yeah,
plenty of
yeah,
I see plenty of legacy
yeah,
stuff where I'm like, what are you doing?
yeah.
Um,
So who's going to do that? I mean, it seems like a big ask for companies.
it well, it would be if you had to do this all manually, right? If you
Hmm.
were sitting there and going through and, you know, you had somebody who's just looking at every repo every week, right? Of all the things you
Right.
consume and like, what's going on in that community? It would take forever. Um,
Hmm.
there are two real automation strategies here. One is you automate gathering the vulnerability information. There's ways to do that. Um,
Hmm.
we're one, it works great. But somehow you automate your inventory to, usually through a provider, to automatically tell you when anything in your inventory has a new vulnerability, right? So you're kind of depending on that data stream. The other method is to try to keep everything as up to date as you can anyways, because that'll fix most vulnerabilities before you know about them, right? If you fixed it, I
Hmm.
guess you don't really need to know about it anymore. So that strategy is more proactive and actually oddly harder to do well. Keeping all
Hmm.
of your things up to date, because you can't just update, you can't just automatically. This isn't Windows and you sign up for automatic updates and everything's fine,
Right.
right? This is much more complex than that because you have conflicts between all the different open source components. You have, like I mentioned, quality issues, and you just have functional problems, right? That I update because there's this vulnerability, but that breaks the functionality I use because they
Right.
removed that.
Right.
So this is a complex problem to solve. The only methods to really solve it are through automation or spending a lot of money. So automation tends to win.
Right. Well.
And yeah, I mean, or spending a ton of manual time, right? But fundamentally, it needs to be an automated solution of some kind to be able to do this at any real scale.
Hmm.
If you're consuming one open source component because you're doing very little code, I guess it's not that bad. But who among us is doing that, right?
Right.
Realistically, it's hundreds.
Right. So yeah, I want to go back to one thing that you just mentioned is fixing a vulnerability can uh, break a release basically, or a functionality in a release. So how do you go about kind of balancing? It's like code. I mean, obviously a vulnerability needs to be fixed, but
Yeah,
how do you keep it from becoming this domino effect?
I don't think I've had a dad joke in this webinar at all. So
No, I don't
very,
think so.
very carefully. Uh,
All right. Fair enough.
Sorry,
So,
I had to throw one in.
yeah.
Look, I mean, there's a couple of strategies here for how you make sure. Sandbox environments are great,
Mhm,
right? Update everything, run a sandbox, run your application in the sandbox, run through your automated test suite. Hopefully it's automated, and it should be, and see if anything broke, right?
mhm.
Not a horrible way of doing it. Same way you would handle any other
Sure.
change you do, right? I committed, make a new commit. Something's double checking that.
Mhm,
Um, but a lot of these are a lot more complex and actually do require some level of thought, some level of care, some reviewing of it.
mhm,
So, just to kind of give you an example there, like as a company, we automate pull requests for
mhm.
fixes, right?
Okay.
We know what needs to be updated. We might as well give it to you as a pull request. Um, Theoretically, we could automate the merge. We don't, and we can't, because the developer does need to sit there, look at it, and actually go, okay, this will or will not work, right? They need to be able to see things like the differences between the versions, right? What changed? Did
Mhm,
anything get removed? So there is still a little bit of manual work, but what you can do is automate the discovery and most of that information flow. Um, it does still require a human at some point sometimes to make a decision. Even if you've automated everything and it's going through an automated test suite, you still have a human involved at some point to either fix the conflicts or make decisions. So thankfully, we aren't all obsolete yet. We still need people.
So who is that human then? Do you actually have a dedicated person who's handling that kind of thing, or is it something that kind of goes, as you said, goes back to the developers for them to look at and fix? Um, yeah,
So there's two schools of thought here, but I will
yeah,
share that I think the best practice is always to go back to the developers.
okay.
Um, if you're big enough and you have a dedicated team, it's fine, right? But I don't think any of us are dealing with trillion-dollar development organizations.
Hmm.
Um, you know, Realistically, the principle in DevOps of empowering all your developers to be able to handle these kinds of things needs to be reinforced. There is nothing wrong with handing vulnerabilities back to developers, letting them understand this pain, making sure they understand the value of security, and letting them own the remediation, right?
Hmm.
Um, that could be guided by a subject matter expert, somebody who's an expert in vulnerabilities or security. Um, and that's always a good practice to have somebody, a champion, somebody who knows kind of this more in depth than the general knowledge,
Hmm.
and make that person available. But generally, the advice would be to empower the person who's developing that part of the application, and letting them have all the information and letting them make the decision and owning the fix.
What if that creates a bottleneck though? Because if you've got a developer who's working on multiple projects at once and you're throwing stuff back at him slash her to fix vulnerabilities, obviously that is going to impact the amount of time that the developer can spend on these other new projects. So, you
It
know,
it not only can, it almost always
yeah,
does.
yeah.
And
So what do you do in that situation?
there's two big things. The best way is to mitigate that bottleneck as much as you can. So I
Hmm.
mentioned earlier when we were talking about policies, how you
Hmm.
might have a policy for severity. The
Right.
purpose of that is to cut down the number of things that you're handing these developers,
Hmm.
right? If it's a low likelihood, risk, I'll go back to my, grade school days, right? What is risk? Impact times likelihood,
Hmm.
basic definition of risk. If it's going to be low likelihood or it has a very low impact, you might decide to not bother developers because
Hmm.
you can't flood them with a ton of these.
Right.
They will become a bottleneck. So you
Right.
need to get it to the least amount that you are comfortable with for your risk level of your application. So the policies inform how you're handing the information to the developer. And the other part is you hand them as much information as you can. Um, Cut down the amount of time it takes to actually do something
Mm,
with that
okay.
fix, right? So you hand them the fix version.
Hmm.
Again, you try to automate this as much as possible. Hand all the information to them. Automate the fixed version. Automate which piece of code, which area of the product this is affecting. Um, Give them as much information as possible, but give them the least amount of things to do, right?
No, that makes total sense. Yeah. Yeah.
And even then, like you still have bottlenecks, but fundamentally, there is always going to be a trade-off between
Mm.
the time spent developing new features and the time spent maintaining your current code, whether it's for quality or security reasons. Security is has a pretty good case for being a very
Yeah.
high priority.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, okay. So, would you suggest maybe the lower vulnerability open source code, the lower risk ones, maybe they can get pushed to maybe junior developers or
Junior
those who are.
developers, you can essentially safely backlog them.
Hmm.
Um, Look, I'm a product person at heart, right?
Right.
And the way I would think of it is, not all fixes, just like not all feature requests, are as valuable or as impactful,
Hmm.
and you do have to somehow prioritize them.
Right.
There's a lot of different ways to do that, but you prioritize them, and you need to end up with a backlog, the same way we all
Okay.
have on our dev teams from our product people. There are things that we will fix when we get around to it,
Hmm.
or when I'm in that area of the product. So I like to do my backlogs. All right, we have a whole little backlog for an area of the product. If we do something major in that area, we're going to look at the rest.
Hmm.
So it might be one of those where you decide, you know what, when we have a major vulnerability in that component, we'll make sure we take care of all the lesser vulnerabilities at that time. I
Okay.
kind of kill many birds with one stone. Violent metaphor, but there you are.
Those poor birds.
I guess.
Okay. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at our last best practices, which obviously, it seems like a gimme. Another gimme is monitor for new risks. But again, we've talked about this. It doesn't seem like something that a lot of companies are doing on at least on a regular basis. What are some of the things that companies can do, or some of the ways that they can kind of monitor for new risks without taking up too much time or effort on their part?
And it's funny, we put a lot more effort on basically saying whether or not something that's coming in is going to be okay,
Hmm.
than we, meets our policies, to be more precise,
Hmm.
than we do on what are we doing with all the stuff we have.
Right.
And risks come in a lot of forms. My personal favorite is every time I look at somebody's repo, there's always one or two, they come to us and we do our inventory build, and they're always like, I didn't know I had that.
Yeah. Right.
Like, where did that come
Where'd that
from?
come from?
And, and a lot of times they're not even using it. It's just sitting there, in
Right.
their repos. And, you know, there's that risk of just you're creating overhead for yourself by
Hmm.
not grooming, if you will, your repository and your code. So you have components you're not using or not using much, or you have 7 components that all do the exact same thing, but now you're trying to fix 7 sets of vulnerabilities.
Yikes.
Yeah, horrible. People don't go back and clean up is basically where it boils down to.
Hmm.
That includes things like forgetting about a component and letting it go out of date. Or I mentioned earlier, you want to use components from active communities. Communities change over time.
Hmm.
So that community that was really active 3 years ago is now stopped doing anything, and you have your critical dependency on a component that has no active open source uh, support.
Hmm.
That would be a big risk.
Right.
Um, Monitoring is the area where people pay the least attention, and that's a mistake. You have to actually keep your inventory up to date. You have to keep checking your inventory. Again, it goes back to automating as much as possible and applying the right policies.
So we've got situations where open source vulnerabilities kind of introduce issues into the code, security issues. But what about and I'm not sure if I can actually explain this correctly, but what about as code progresses, as new features are introduced, that actually impacts the code in a way that it becomes vulnerable. And I'm not sure if that's something that that is even an issue. But are there any sort of controls that an organization can put on with these policies or such to kind of recognize that when you have new features or changes to the code, we need to make sure that we're not inadvertently introducing vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and this happens because sure, you want all your
Mhm.
components to be as secure as possible,
Right.
but you do, just by definition, if you're adding new features, you're changing how the code works.
Hmm.
And when you change those code works, how it works, some doors open, some doors close.
Right.
That's sort of my very brief analogy. Um, I mentioned already, you want to know which one's closed because maybe you're not even using a component anymore.
Right.
But you are and often opening up to more things. This starts getting a little messy, but it does sort of go back to my manufacturing analogy at the beginning.
Hmm.
I'm putting two pieces together. I need to know how they interact, not just that I have two pieces.
Right.
And you do change how things interact. Um, and a vulnerability that is low impact and has a very low chance of being exploited can, with one software change, suddenly be extremely high impact. So you have to keep continually basically updating everything we've talked about to make sure you're keeping up with that. It's kind of a pain. It's but that's how it works, right? You
Yeah.
have to keep up. Um, the other piece is just to knowing what you're doing and the impact of what you're doing is sort of fundamental to development as a whole. But
Hmm. Well, it's certainly an argument for automation.
I mean,
So.
at the end of the day, automation is an assisting tool, right? It gets you information. That's what it's
Hmm.
for the most part in development. And you know, automating as much of that information flow as you can just cuts down on the time and lets you focus on what you actually want to do instead of updating libraries.
Hmm. Right. 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 All right. Cool. Well, we are at about 14 minutes to the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the question and answer period of today's webinar. We've gotten some great questions in so far, but there's still plenty of time if you guys have a question for Jeffrey. Don't send me a question because he's the smart guy. Just go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. Let's go ahead and dive right on into the ones we have. Okay, so would it be a good idea to have a certification group, board, or entity that does security static analysis, dynamic malware analysis, etc., on open source code? And if it complies, then certify that particular version?
Yeah, so I saw this question. I kind of love it. Um,
Kind of.
I think I touched on it earlier, right? Um, if the scale of your organization can support it, my big
Hmm.
caveat, right? Because you don't want a board for a five-person development team.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but yes, it is not a bad practice. You're knocking on the door there of having a white list of components. That's really close to what you're getting to there. Because once you go through all of that and you certify that particular major version, right? And you're right, you don't want to focus on minor fixes. It's just it balloons out of the. It really does get too big,
Hmm.
even if you have dedicated people. Um, and I love the fact that I believe he phrased it as it's not a certification is not a guarantee. It's
Right.
a validation that it's quote safe to use. Um, yeah, I would say it's been screened for major risks, right?
Right. Right.
Um,
Right.
it's a great idea if you have the resources to do it and if you can get the full buy-in there. The the part where I always see that struggle is actually from a organizational behavior standpoint, where
Hmm.
developers don't like to be told what to do. So the only real way to do a board like that actually get decent um, uptake and not
Hmm.
people just fighting against it
Hmm.
is to grab one or two champions from the actual development org, bring them over, include them in that process. People who are respected by the rest of development. We all have those people. Um, Bringing them in, getting the education out to everybody about why this kind of thing is important. But I do love, honestly, that whole golden repo or safe repo or, artifact repository of all of these safe components pull from here.
Yeah.
It does solve a lot of problems if you can justify the overhead.
Hmm. All right. Great. Gosh, we've gotten some great questions. And
We
next
really did.
question, yeah. How can you tell what components of the open source codes are actually being used in my app?
It's magic.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no,
Gremlins. They kind of pop in and say, oh no, there they are. So,
There's a whole, I think he's asking, like, because I mentioned we do it as a company. There's a whole uh, market here called software
mhm,
composition analysis. Literally what composes my software. And we're the leader because we're awesome and you should totally look at us. But um, plugs
shameless plug.
aside, basically it involves matching. Go through, scan through the entire bit of code, match it against a database of known libraries,
Mhm.
and tell you what you have. It's actually not as complex as you would think. From a conceptual level, technically it's a giant pain, but anybody could do it.
Yeah.
But from a conceptual level, we're basically just going through, looking at your code automatically, building a list, and comparing it and making sure we uniquely identify it.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. Next question. Can a mature observability structure be an effective mitigation against risk and vulnerability, or is the function used solely for performance?
That's a very interesting question. Yes. Usually it has to be pretty mature to be
Mhm.
clear. Um, yes, I know it's used for performance, but from this standpoint, in terms of being able to classify your risk, it's another very important piece of information that goes down to basically exploitability, right? You can have a critical vulnerability inside of a library that isn't actually exploitable because of the way you're implemented. So a good good observation structure. I gave up
Observational.
on that word. Uh, observation structure allows you to add more information for those triage processes. It's actually really helpful.
Mhm.
And look, knowledge is always good for risk mitigation. It kind of doesn't matter what the knowledge is almost.
Right, right. Okay. Okay, so here's a question here, and I'm not quite sure what he's asking, so hopefully you'll be better at it than me, Jeffrey. What are the most common vulnerabilities detection support tools than those network access related and interfaces?
If I'm understanding the question correctly,
Mhm,
um, and that's an if here, um, I believe he's asking, how do I sort of, what tools do I use to identify
mhm,
my inventory and what's vulnerable?
right.
So, I kind of hinted at this a few times. We make one, so you're welcome to use ours. Um, we even have some free versions. But, fundamentally, there's several out there.
Mhm,
Um, this is different than the tools that you're using for network vulnerabilities or access stuff, right? This is component based.
mhm.
It's your software's composition. So, Google software composition analysis, you get a huge amount of tools, but that's generally speaking the technology's name. So hopefully that helped him.
Yeah, hopefully. Okay. And he actually followed up with vulnerability mapping support tools, software APIs, question
I
mark.
think he was just
Great.
continuing the previous question.
Okay. All right. Great. 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 All right. So we have time for, I think, one more question here. And actually, you just talked about this, so but I'm going to ask it again. So in case you wanted to add any more to it, are there any good free tools out there to monitor / notify us on open source vulnerabilities?
So yes, we have one. It's called White Source Bolt. Googled
Really?
it using, yeah, it's shocking, right? Um, but there are other ones, and GitHub itself has security alerts now. So if you're using GitHub, security alerts is actually very helpful here. Um, and just fundamentally, um, there is good tooling out there. Not all of it is free.
Hmm.
But the free tools do a pretty decent job. If you are in GitHub, I'd recommend checking out security alerts. It actually will help you out on this piece.
Hmm.
Again, that's actually selfish of me. We power that, so but we don't get any, you're not gonna have to pay us anything, so have fun. And then there is that other category of free tools that help out here, um, which I think I mentioned it earlier. We have one. It's open source, so it's free, called Renovate.
Hmm.
Very helpful for keeping things up to date. But also Dependabot is in the same space there as well.
We also, in the ebook, we also mentioned the US CERT. They have a vulnerability database, and Google often does talks about vulnerabilities in its security blog. So those are also good resources for that. So.
I see one other question here that I think we should answer, which is when will the archive session be available?
After today's webinar, we will be sending out a link. You're killing my closing statements here, Jeffrey. No, the archives are going to be available later on today. So, and we will be sending out an email to everybody who registered so that they can access it on demand. So, fear not, it'll be coming soon, as well as a link to the ebook. So, but yeah, coming soon to a desktop near you. So, all right, well, we're about 5 minutes to the top of the hour. So that is pretty much all the time that we have for the question and answer period. I did say at the top of the hour that we would be doing a drawing for 3 $50 Amazon gift cards. So we'll do that real quick, and then we'll close out today's webinar. Today's winners for the $50 Amazon gift cards are Gerald W. Congratulations, Gerald. Mark W. I'm sensing a theme here. Congratulations, Mark. And Andrew C. Congratulations, Andrew. We will be following up with all three of you following today's webinar via email to get your gift card over to you. So just check out your inbox, look out for that email, and we'll get it over to you. Also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So as I just said, if you missed any or all of the event, or if you just want to watch it again, you will have the opportunity to do so with the archived on-demand copy. We will be sending out that email later on today that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. The webinar is also going to be on the Security Boulevard website, so you can always go look for it there. Just go to securityboulevard.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Jeffrey, thank you so much for the time. Always a pleasure to have a conversation with you.
Oh, I enjoy it. So great.
Excellent.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe out there. It's a crazy time.
Yes. Crazy, crazy days, crazy times. Yes, everybody, please be safe. I want to thank the audience for joining me today. And this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe.